Welcome, friends, to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we are off for the holidays. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. This is when it should be coming out, so hopefully you're enjoying it. But we are releasing this previous Patreon exclusive, Jodorowsky's Dune, which is billed as the greatest film never made, or specifically a documentary about this film.
Highly influential, too. We talk about Geiger, who was involved in the creation of the design for Alien.
Yeah.
The aliens, the xenomorphs.
Xenomorphs, yeah. And their whole, just like, everything, the look of that film.
And so you can see some of the design elements pop up in Star Wars all over the place.
Right.
So it's wild that this was never created, and then eventually David Lynch creates his version, and now we're getting the Denis Villeneuve sort of possibly ultimate version of Dune at this point. Hopefully the second part sticks the landing.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting, I think, for fans of Dune to at least know about this. I highly recommend watching the documentary, but check out our episode on it, and we'll give you a taste and see if it sounds interesting to you. But there's just so much cool history of Hollywood, history of science fiction, caught up in this unmade film that I had no idea about until I watched this. So yeah, really fun one. I remember we recorded this one, I think, a little over a year ago. It's a bonus episode for patrons. Speaking of, we just recorded another bonus episode for our patrons. This is on the fall of the House of Usher. It'll be coming out soon. I'm talking about the 1960 Corman version of the fall of the House of Usher. So if you want to hear our thoughts on that one, definitely check us out on Patreon. Last thing I'll say before we unlock this thing, this is your last day to get suggestions in to our poll over on Patreon to suggest what our next quarterly project will be. Literally today, Thanksgiving. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to take the ones that have the 4 most likes, and I'm going to create a dedicated poll for patrons that will run for 1 week that will determine our next quarterly project. So if you'd like to be able to vote on that poll, now's a great time to become a patron. We'd love to have you over there.
All right, and we hope you enjoy this previous Patreon exclusive. We're covering Jodorowsky's Dune, or Jodorowsky's Dune, however that's pronounced. It's kind of difficult to say, and we watched
Jodorowsky. It's like in my mind, I hear the way it's supposed to be pronounced, but then my tongue fumbles to say it right,
Well, and in the doc, it's called Jodorowsky's Dune. It came out in 2013, and many people say it many different ways, so I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, that doesn't help, yeah. It's a documentary. If you're curious what it's about this wild acid trip of a Dune adaptation that almost got made in the 70s, and there's huge implications for, I think, the filmmaking industry. It's just a really interesting topic, and I'm really glad I watched the documentary. Excited to talk to you about it, because I'm sure you'll have tons of insights, and I'm curious to know what it means to you after watching it. But yeah, before we get to that, I'm just going to briefly talk about something pretty big for me, in that I finally finished. Well, I finished the book that I've been writing for 5 years. Now, what does that mean? It's not actually done. It's not like I'm ready to post it on Amazon for people to read. I got the draft finished, which even that is a little misleading, because I've been rewriting this thing, and it's gone through many drafts already, but it was never like a completed readable draft until now. It is a wild underwater, sort of Western influenced, cyberpunk influenced, sci-fi action thing, and it's sort of ambitious and weird and out of my comfort zone, because in the past I've written a lot of fantasy. That was my other novel, was a fantasy novel. This is my first sci-fi novel. And as I'm watching Jodorowsky's Dune, I'm just thinking about this guy's super ambitious, wild project that didn't end up getting made. So I'm there's also a cautionary tale here for me, but it was also inspiring, and it's just part of me is just going for something that I don't know if it's going to work, and there is an industry of movie making that his film ended up hitting and bouncing off of, in a way. And there is an industry in writing fiction and doing traditional publishing. And, that's where I'm going to try and go with it. I'm going to try the next step is I'm going to send it to the beta readers. They're going to give me feedback, and then I'll do another revision. But I'm hoping, before the year is out, to be querying for a new agent, a new literary agent, because I had to fire a previous one, but that's a whole other story. And if I get a new literary agent, knock on wood, then it'll be a process of querying the book to those publishers and seeing if I can find somebody who believes in it in the way that you need, right? It's kind of like trying to find a studio. Someone who's willing to put money behind it, the publisher's money behind it, because they think that they can do something with it, right? And think it's marketable. So it's an exciting process. There's a lot of things that I don't know how it's going to go. But the thing that had to be done first, and I've been chasing for almost half a decade now, like I think it's actually, no, more than half a decade, because I think it's over 5 years I've been working on this, is I had to get the draft done. I had to get it to a readable point where I could send it to some readers and like start getting feedback and start getting it ready. And so this was a big thing for me, actually getting it done. I think about 5 years ago, I bought this like super, like over $100, I think it was like $130, $140 bottle of Lagavulin Distiller's Edition. And I was like, oh, I'll open this when I finish the draft. And this was back in like 2017. I thought it was going to be like a year, maybe two. And it's just been sitting on my shelf, getting dust on it, So I'm going to open that tonight. Honestly, that's my plan, because I've done it now. And I'm like, I still kind of can't believe that I actually did it. Super exciting. It's not done, quote unquote, but it is an important step along the way. I had somebody on Twitter ask me, they're like, oh yeah, I know this stuff takes a long time, but when's it gonna be published? When's it gonna be out? And I'm like, I don't know, man. I gotta get a publisher first. Like, I can't tell you when you can actually read this thing. Sorry, I wish I could, but that would take a literal crystal ball, because there's so many things that I don't know how it's gonna go. But it's exciting. This is what I want to do. I want to be a novelist, and I've been doing short fiction on the side, and I enjoy doing that. But novels are, I think, where my heart's at, and I'm just really excited about this thing. Oh, there's tons of references to ink to film projects in the book.
Yeah. Well, hold on. Before we get ahead of ourselves, congratulations on finishing your draft. Seriously, it's a huge deal.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I haven't talked to you about it because I figured we'd talk about it today. So I haven't really told you about it, talked to you about it at all.
I'd been following online. I'd seen some posts and stuff, so I was excited for you. I was shocked when you posted multiple days in a row that you were breaking records and stuff. Did you feel a little bit like you were channeling Stephen King, like some sort of?
You know what's insane? So I feel like people who don't write might not know what does that mean, right? 6,000 words. Let's just call it 6,000, even though it was more than that. 6,000 words. If you do NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month that people do in November every year, they try and write a novel in a month. The novel that they try and write is 50,000 words. So 50,000 words over the course of a month, what does that come out to? I think it's like 1,667 is what I believe, words per day. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing I don't know, 4 times that. That's what I did over the weekend. Now, of course, could I keep that up for a month? No way in hell. I kind of hit my stride, and I could see the finish line. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew how the book ended, and I just had to get it out. So all of that helped me to drive through. Whereas early on in a book where you're still discovering, sometimes it's a lot harder to get those words. So you have good days and bad days. Where was I going with this? I was going to tell you,
ink to film.
Ink to film references. So there's a bunch of references in there. I might put a few more in, honestly, through the revision process. Some of them are subtle. Some of them are so overly subtle that I might be the only one who even knows that's what I'm doing. Some of them are pretty obvious. I think everybody will get it. But if you're an ink to film listener, I think that would be fun if one day when you get your hands on the book is to try and identify how many references to projects that we've covered over the years are in there, because I definitely included a bunch.
I'm sure. I mean, I can't even imagine how much was being infused through you, tons of inspiration coming from so many different, filmmakers and authors all throughout, hundreds of years and stuff. So how could it not? I was going to, and this, it's such an interesting time to cover this as well. This Jodorowsky's Dune.
Really is.
Jodorowsky's Dune. So I remember when this came out in 2013, and I remember hearing people talk about Jodorowsky's Dune for a long time and how it was so influential. And so I didn't ever understand how it was so influential when it was never made. I just couldn't wrap my head around that. I'm like, how does
they call it the greatest movie never made in the documentary, and I totally I could see it.
It's like, how does something that's never made influence everything? And then you go and look at the process, you go and look at the people who worked on it, and then they've literally storyboarded with fantastic storyboarders and created the entire film.
Famous comic artists and H.R. Geiger.
They created this really small, tiny little book that they then took. No, I'm kidding. It's massive. The biggest book I've ever seen, potentially. Book that they took to every studio.
Yeah.
And from those studios, no one wanted to make it. Everybody thought it was brilliant and amazing. No one wanted to make it though. And so what happens is
real quick, I do just want to say, like, there's a ton of interesting detail. There's so many things, and we're going to hit a good amount of it in this episode. But if you want to actually know everything, like, watch the documentary, because we can't cover everything, and there's a lot of super cool stories, like a lot of specifics that we'll probably get wrong. So, like, I do recommend watching the documentary. This is going to be a very Cliff Notesy version where we're just reacting to the stuff that was most interesting to us.
Right. Having one covered almost everything that they mention in the film.
Yeah.
That's like sort of is spun off from Jodorowsky's Dune.
Or just being a huge fan, like Alien. Like, I'm a huge fan of Alien. We haven't covered it, but man, I love it. So
yeah. And then, but like Alien is Ridley, and then Ridley goes on to make Blade Runner, which is a direct connection to Ink to Film, and like so many of those things happening.
So, but Alien is H.R. Geiger, obviously design, and then also, what was his name? Dan O'Bannon? Yes. Who was one of the guys they brought in to work on this movie. He goes on to write it and work with Geiger. So, like, the connections are direct.
Right. And you look at some of the imagery that Geiger was working with. Totally, just like,
what a legend too.
Yeah, and Jodorowsky himself going on to, by the way, I immediately went and bought, I think it's the Inkle. It's
the one he made kind of based off of his Dune ideas.
Some of them, like, I think he spread them all out.
And he's working with, what's the other guy's name?
Mobius. He went on to like create this together with him, and he was the one who was doing the storyboarding. He was like a comic book artist turned storyboarder for, and then he also had someone who was doing sci-fi covers, like covers of sci-fi.
Yeah, that guy was cool. Chris Ross. I can't remember all the names. There's so many names, but that guy does they showed all these sci-fi novel covers. They're all from the 70s, like this golden era of sci-fi. And I don't know, just really cool, iconic covers. Even for some of them are for books I didn't know, but I think I saw an Asimov cover in there. Or,
was that Foss?
Foss, yeah, that's it. I thought it was Ross, but it's Foss. Yeah, I think that's what it was.
It's so interesting. So this person has such a force of, like, for one, he gets his start in basically experimental filmmaking, like guerrilla filmmaking.
So before, I'm going to stop you right there though. So like, you'd heard about this guy, but you didn't know the story, right?
I mean, I knew some of it, and in our I mentioned Jodorowsky's Dune in our Dune coverage, and like I knew some of the story, I knew some of the influence, but again, you can't put the pieces together until you know the whole story.
Yeah. I had heard. I think my friend Remy Nakamura, who's been on the podcast, he was telling me about it. He had, I think, watched the documentary, and I'd heard a couple other people reference it, and I was like, oh man, I really want to get onto that. So I that's something that I've been wanting to see for a while, but I didn't know this guy. He's such a wild, mad, genius type, but also like out of control. Like it feels like Completely. He's like just a mess of a person.
At one point, he's just talking about like raping Frank Herbert, and I was so hurt by the fact that
was very that was a big yike for me.
Yeah, that and then the part before it, he's just saying like any filmmaker who wants to adapt something is raping the source material, and I was like, this doesn't work for me, man.
That's choose a different metaphor, dude. This one's pretty bad. He's like rape with love, and I'm like, no, that's not a thing.
Doesn't make it better. Yeah, he's that kind of guy though. Like like just gonna say whatever he wants to, and he's from the 70s, obviously making films in the 70s.
And you're watching his movies he made, like they're showing clips from them, and I'm like, holy shit, these are wild.
Now, the Holy Mountain, I have heard of.
It's so weird, like just the clips of it, I'm like, I can't believe this. And then what's that, El Toco or something, the other one was also just unbelievable.
I'm super passionate about how crazy this is. Like, just watch this documentary, and you get a really good feel for like the influence that's there. And there's tons of filmmakers like Nicholas Winding Refn. Shows up. Who's who directed like Drive.
Oh, that guy. Yeah. He was cool.
So I think he's the voice where people are like
Ryan Gosling Drive.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that movie a lot actually. I didn't know that was who that was. That's cool.
He kind of legitimizes, I think, for some of the, like the modern viewers. Yeah. Like him saying all this stuff like legitimizes Jodorowsky and makes you realize like, holy shit, like look at all this influence. And then they have other filmmakers who come in, right, to our generation. And they have other filmmakers come in who talk about, this is that's another thing we should say, pre-Star Wars.
Yeah, like early 70s, like 74, like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and like people are doing a good job to show like the scope of what he was going for. Lucas wouldn't even go for in the prequels, like way huge, crazy scope. So we talked about Trumbull recently, who did the effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Right.
And he approached this person to do the effects, and they just didn't connect well together. So this guy's like, "Fuck him, we don't need him. We'll find someone else."
It's so funny, like the stories of how he did that. Like he went and met this guy, and the guy was this like slick, like Hollywood effects guy who everybody was like obsessed with. Right, he's a big deal, and he's taking phone calls apparently while he's meeting with this guy, and he's just like, "Nope. This is not going to happen." And he like walks out on him, and he's like, "No way I'm working with him." He's like, "I'm looking for my mystical warriors or something." Like he wanted his mystical
very
fighters.
Spiritual. Yeah.
It was like people were comparing him to a cult leader, and I got that vibe from him, like super into it. And then he gives the story about going to meet with Dan O'Bannon, and I think it was like Dan O'Bannon was giving the story, or maybe it was his wife. I can't remember, but somebody was saying like, he shows up and he gives him this, like, he's like, "This is a very special cigarette or something, marijuana cigarette." And so he smokes it, and apparently it's got some sort of hallucinogen in it, because he like starts hallucinating Jodorowsky, like having this Mandela coming out of his head while he's describing the movie to him. And he's like just completely taken with it. And then by the time he finishes, he's like, "It's you, man. You need to come work on this movie with me." And he goes, "Okay." And he goes, "Sell everything you own and move to Paris." And Dan O'Bannon's like, "All right." So he just moves his entire life to Paris.
It's amazing. I mean, it's this kind of stuff that you can never like imagine. And like these people who are just like black holes that pull everything towards them. I think they even call him that at one point.
Yeah.
And
he was so passionate about it. You could tell like how passionate he was about it. One more wild detail.
Yeah.
He didn't even read the book. I couldn't believe it. Like, he meets with this producer who's like, "I've seen your movies. Your movies are amazing. What do you want to make?" And he goes, "Dune." And he's like, "All right, we'll make Dune." And then in the documentary, he's like, "I hadn't even read it at the time. I had a friend who read it and said it was amazing. So right. I just pulled it." He's like, "I could have done anything. I could have said Don Quixote. I could have said this other stuff, but I went with Dune."
I think he does eventually read
Well, sure,
Dune.
because he writes this screenplay based off of it, but he hadn't read it when he pitched to the producer that he was going to make it.
Yeah, and so he goes around and he gets people like Mick Jagger and Orson Welles.
Every one of those has a wild story attached to it. My favorite one is Salvador Dali.
Yes.
That was one of my favorite stories. So he wants Salvador Dali to play the emperor. He's like, Dali is not an actor. I don't know if he maybe had been in a movie or something. I don't know. But he's an artist, you know? But he goes and he has this like weird courtship that he describes with Dali, where they're both these like big figures in the surrealist movement at the time. And it seemed like Dali was aware of him, had seen maybe some of his movies. And so that he was like, they were trying to outdo each other with their just bizarreness. And so he's like sending him a tarot card and like that he's signed. He's asking, Dali asks him these like weird question about whether he's ever found a clock on a beach or something.
Yeah.
Like there's all these little tests they're giving for each other. They meet at a art museum to discuss this in front of like this giant painting of a fart or something, apparently. I don't know.
That's what Dali interpreted it as.
That was Dali's interpretation. And I just the meeting of these two just wild Frenchmen just really delighted me. And then the idea that Dali like wanted to be the highest paid actor ever in a movie, and he wanted $100,000 per hour or something, and then like they end up negotiating that he'll get $100,000 per minute, but it's per minute of screen time. And so Dali accepts because I guess it would be like the most ever for him. But like that also just shows you like how the budget is just ballooning out of control already at this point.
Well, and I think the thing that torpedoed this whole project was like he was so uncompromising in his vision, to the point that he said he was going to studios and telling them, I won't make an hour and a half, 2-hour movie. I'll make a 20-hour movie. And no studio is ever going to let you do that ever. And I understand that, like, you know, it's holding back his vision.
I mean, but you do see Peter Jackson nowadays. You see Denis Villeneuve making a multi-part Dune. So like it's like he was just before his time. That's one thing they said. Like this was a movie that was being made before its time.
Yeah, and so the I guess to come back around to this, there's this giant coffee table book that would be the coolest piece, like centerpiece in anybody's house, right?
Yeah.
Like,
apparently only a few of them exist.
Only a couple left, yeah. And this was passed around all the studios.
people basically say for a fact that Lucas had his hands on it, was able to look through it, some of the storyboarding, because again, their entire movie was just out there for everyone to see. So you could flick through, look at the storyboards, you could steal shots, you could steal ideas, you could steal H.R. Geiger style from this and choose this there. And so everyone saw this all in the 70s, and then you see the end of the 70s and the early 80s, there's massive influence from this stuff. And now, interesting to note, do I think that this movie would live up to and be as good as what this documentary would have you believe? I actually don't know that it would be.
No,
you know what I mean? Who knows if it would be good?
Weird.
Yes.
And it would be something worth watching. I'm sure it would have a cult following. Would it have made enough money to offset its huge budget? Probably not.
So it's almost like the influence of this movie almost being made had more influence than if it had. If it had been made and it was like a flash, like no one cared about it, then it just goes away and nobody talks about it.
So his son in this documentary, first off, he was a part of this story that was pretty wild.
He was supposed to play Paul.
He was going to play Paul Atreides, and he trained with like a master martial artist for years, it seemed like body and mind, to be able to like become Paul Atreides.
For years, yeah. The guys that he trained with was Jean-Pierre Vignau.
Which is wild that even happened. And he's going to play Paul Atreides, right? But then this movie doesn't end up happening. But in the documentary, he gave a really good comparison I actually really liked. So in his father's version of Dune, he changed the ending, and at the end of the movie, Paul Atreides gets his throat slashed. I forget by who. And he's killed, but when he's killed, his consciousness goes into all the people. I think the Fremen and maybe just everybody, and they all start saying, like, I am Paul Atreides.
Yeah, I gotta jump in here and say, though, I felt that wasn't... I was so bummed that was his, like, masterpiece ending, because Spartacus came out before this. Like, so many films had already done the I'm Spartacus and, like, the whole... But this is more of a...
It is a very I am Spartacus moment, I get.
But this is, like, a metaphysical sort of, like, magical way for everyone to say I'm Paul Atreides. So it's, like, it's a play on that, though.
Yeah, it's not just, like, an inspiration. Like, he's actually going into all of these people's minds. Anyway, but you're right. That's not, it's not as maybe original as it might sound, but it's definitely weird and interesting, and apparently it's the culmination of a metaphysical, message behind the movie that, like, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe would be more apparent to us if we'd actually seen the movie and not just documentary about it.
Yeah. So to give him credit, though, he did, the whole, like, I'm Paul Atreides, everything like that. But then, like, the planet completely, like, terraforms or, like, changes immediately, and, like, everything switches over. So, like,
I think that happens in later Dune books. I haven't read them, so I don't know if that's, like, a spoiler, because it's based off of stuff I've, like, kind of heard about. I think there's some terraforming that goes on. I don't know how
but it's, like,
it is.
Instantaneous. So it's like he went on to explain that this is like
I guarantee you he wasn't reading 7 Dune novels or whatever.
Right. This is the consciousness of the world, and the world is taking on Paul's soul as well, and all this other stuff. And it's like people can change the world, that sort of thing, like all together if we band together and have like-minded.
It is interesting that like Frank Herbert's novel definitely has a philosophy and a spirituality and some weird ideas in there, and I think it just gets weirder over time from what I've heard. So it's interesting, marriage between the two. But anyway, all of this was to set up this metaphor that his son makes that I actually really liked, where he says that like his father's Dune is much like Paul Atreides in his version of Dune, because although the movie was killed, it is popping up in all these other things where they're saying like, I am Dune, I am Dune, I am Dune. And he says he sees it in, Blade Runner, he sees it in all this other stuff. So I just thought that was a cool metaphor, right? Like, and it feels that way too. Like this movie never got made, yet its influence is felt across the industry.
And honestly, the justice of it all comes back around to people know, and people are so familiar with the influence. And then also, he threaded all of the things he wanted to do in this Dune film into his comics, which I think is amazing. Like that he was still able to express them in some avenue.
That's cool. Yeah.
So like I'm gonna definitely be reading his stuff. Like I said, I bought one of his comics. I've also heard people talk of that comic before. Never even realized it was Jodorowsky.
I had never heard of that one. That's cool. I'm not as like into the comic scene as you are, though, so that makes sense. I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to see like the frame by frames. They pull a shot from the storyboard, and then they show shots from like Flash Gordon, shots from
Flash Gordon was the most direct one, I think. Raiders of the Lost Ark there was like a scene, like like different scenes from different things. Yeah.
And you're seeing the influence these days. Like if you like the new Thor movies, like Ragnarok and Love and Thunder, are a Flash Gordon film. Like they're so influenced by that kind of thing. Like,
And that's the thing, the way this inspiration works, right? Like people might not even know that it's going back to this, and I'm sure many people don't. They're referencing Flash Gordon, which it was referencing this in some ways. It seems like a lot of the costuming was so the costuming was like bright and garish and weird, and I don't know how much it would have worked, but like it was like his whole thing was like letting artists come in and do their own weird shit and just embracing it and not caring if it worked. And that was his message in the documentary. He's like, just try it. Nobody cares if you fail. Like, have ambition. Make the movie of your dreams, and I found that inspiring. But and not his message, but the message I'm also taking away from it was that you can have that vision, but you might want to try tempering it to reality if you want it to become a real thing and not something that only exists in your imagination.
it is amazing to think though, like this is pre-Star Wars. People were saying this kind of stuff to George Lucas making Star Wars. You know what I mean? So like someone has to push it along.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like sometimes you make it, but like it does feel like something about the uncompromising vision of this guy is why it didn't happen. If he had been willing to compromise even a little, it might have actually gotten made. And I don't know, like there's something nice about being like, I never compromise, you know, but like the thing didn't get made. So I don't know what the message is there. Like I wanted to ask you how does this make you feel about movies? Does it make you feel cynical about the industry because it didn't embrace something like this fully?
I think that Alejandro Jodorowsky came from experimental indie filmmaking to the extreme, right? He came up making whatever he wanted. No one gave him a shot. He had this movie that happened to like have a cult following, then leveraged that into getting $1 million to make Holy Mountain, which was crazy for the time. And it was insane, and people loved it for that fact. I think when you start talking about larger budgets and you start approaching Hollywood studios, because he wasn't approaching Hollywood studios before this, then you start approaching Hollywood studios.
He talked to Disney.
Right. Yeah, they're money makers. They're machines. They exist to make people money. So like the artistry, like I think most filmmakers and most people who know the industry and know art in this way, and any industry really, they want to see, everyone who watches this documentary wants to see his final vision. They're like, why couldn't they just, take a risk and give him the money on this chance? Because they take a risk all the time with movies that don't deserve it, And I think that's where people come back to. But it ultimately comes back to the people who sign the checks aren't always artists.
Well, he says that in the movie. He's like, they're accountants,
Yeah. And so like you can't approach Hollywood. And I think nowadays people understand that. So for me to feel cynical about it, we're also in like sort of a post studio system society at this point where like there are other avenues. There are large platforms that are willing to, shell out money for some projects here and there.
A24 making wild movies.
Exactly. I mean, Jordan Peele's new Nope movie is like out in theaters right now. And I know that I haven't even seen it yet. And I already know that it's going to be like one of those envelope pushing films where,
I mean, he's a proven moneymaker now though.
Right.
Yeah.
But that comes from, proven success over time.
He had to earn that.
So, and I think that's the thing. Like I think auteur directors now like understand that there's a game that they're playing.
Yeah.
And like you said, you kind of have to make a compromise to get it made. Otherwise, you make something and put it out on your own, or finance it on your own and make it a passion project and do your best to do it. But if you want the studios to back you, like that's their money. You got to guarantee something there. And so to say, no, I'm going to make a 20-hour film.
And I don't know if he's like exaggerating in the moment to to us, the documentary crew, like saying like this is what. I don't know if he was telling like, no, it's gonna be 20 hours to them. I wanted them to say what his actual expected runtime was because I was unclear on that. Maybe he didn't have one. Maybe it was just a super massive book that he didn't know.
Right. And that's the other thing, the effort that went into the book, like although the tragedy is there, again, I'm not cynical because like I don't know that this film would have done well. I think it would have been an amazing watch. I don't know if it would have made people money.
Right. But I mean, like so many movies that we look back on were box office flops, but it have gone on to be really important cult followings. Could it have been something like that? Maybe.
So, I am of two minds about this thing too, because it reminds me a lot of traditional publishing and a lot of the stuff that people argue about with traditional publishing. They're like, why do you want to go into this system that is there to make money? Like you said, like it's the same as these movie studios. And they want to look at your book as a commodity and decide whether or not they can make money off of it. And then they'll decide how much of their capital they want to invest in it based off of how much money they think they can earn. All of that is like accounting, right? Like it's all of that is business. However, to be fair, a lot of the people who get into this industry get into it because they love books. And I'm sure that's true in movie making as well, right? Like people get into the industry because they love movies. Even if they're not the people who are directing and they're the money people, like they still probably love movies. Not all of them maybe, but most of them. So it's of course a little more complicated than that. But because of this, you see a lot of people saying self-published, then you don't have to worry about the system. You don't have to worry about any of that. And there's something to be said for that. And I bet there is really weird, avant-garde, indefinable kind of art being made that doesn't appeal to traditional publishers and either goes the route of like a smaller indie press or just self-publishes. And whether or not it goes on to find an audience, I think it varies. But there are other avenues, like you said, and that makes me feel a little better about it when I start feeling cynical.
And ultimately, I think what we see in the film industry is like people taking chances, doing interesting things, and creating like proof of concepts or short films and bringing them to festivals. And in that way, I think you've talked about how like short fiction is sort of the experimental avenue that like is ahead of traditional publication. Yeah. So like I think that's the same kind of thing going on with film, where you might go see an experimental film, or you might go see something that's just alien to you, but will push the needle and like get people interested in that sort of thing. And every once in a while, one of those is a massive hit, and then they get the financing based on that. In the after film festival. That's why honestly film festivals tend to be like a situation where you bring your movie hoping that someone will see it and want to finance either a larger version or will like distribute it.
I mean, this stuff gets me so pumped, man. Like you can tell that I'm excited. I can tell you're excited. I watch this thing and it's inspiring. I like to see artists who are passionate. I thought one of the best moments, speaking about what we're talking about in the whole documentary, was toward the end when he's talking about the movie not getting made. He is like pounding the table basically and getting angry. You can tell he's got anger about this. It's not like he wasn't raging, but like you could tell he's passionate, right? And he pulls out his wallet and he's like, this, is controlling it. We're slaves to it. And he's showing money. And he's like, it's meaningless. It's empty. And it's determining what art is getting made and what our lives are about. And it was this like kind of great like anti-capitalist moment. And I was kind of cheering him on, even though, like you said, I don't know how much I would actually love this movie if it came out. I don't know. But I want stuff like that to get made. I want people like this to have the chance to make it. And I kind of agree with him when he's talking about that. Again, like I'm kind of two minds about it, because I've always been kind of a realist who is willing to see the world. Like I want to be aspirational and shoot for ideals, but I also am willing to see the world as it is and recognize real limitations that exist and try and work within those frameworks. So on one hand, like I want him to be able to make this movie and succeed, and I know dreamers like that are important to get to push the art form. But on the other hand, I also think there's a cautionary tale here about making sure your ambition doesn't get so big that it can sink your ability to actually create the thing that you want to create.
And someone came on, producer, somebody came along and said in the doc about like, if someone had just set them aside and said like, we have to pitch this in a way that seems appealing to the studio for studio reasons, the movie gets made because everyone was blown away by the book. They had already created the entire film. They just had to go shoot it. They had already approached actors. They had everybody on board. It's unfortunate. And again, I think the legacy that lives on because of it is bigger than what the film may have even been.
They had fucking Pink Floyd on to do music for the movie. Like every time they would talk about some person he was going to get, I'm like, oh, there's no way he's getting them. And then he got them, and like they agreed to do it. And I'm like, holy shit, I can't believe.
And
that.
I think it could have come together to be something incredible, no question. And what's crazy is it could have been genre defining in the way that Star Wars was. And they talk about like, how does that shift our entire like film history in ways to like, you know,
If
to
this
like,
movie gets made, the whole industry is different.
if it's the Star Wars before
Yeah.
Star Wars, like what is the industry? Like, you know, that
Yeah.
if it defined blockbuster filmmaking, like it would have been totally different.
So real quick, I wish this documentary had been made a little bit later so that we could have heard some reactions to Denis Villeneuve's movie. I kept thinking about it and like wondering what people would have thought of it, because there was a lot of talk about Lynch, and it seemed like he had a lot of respect for Lynch. And there was this whole story about he went to see the movie and he was like so upset because he thought that Lynch was going to nail it. But then he saw the movie and was like, "Oh, this is bad. This was the producers did this, not Lynch." And like,
I was so happy to see that, like him sticking by like another, like again, like eccentric auteur filmmaker who got his start in like experimental weird filmmaking stuff. Like that's awesome to see them like to see them like come together and respect each other, and for him to be like, it's a piece of shit, there's no way he made it.
Yeah.
That it ended up being kind of true, you know, in our research of it seems like
super hamstrung by studio. And I mean, this is also like, okay, so speaking about the new Dune, this really drives home for me how insanely difficult it is to make a Dune movie, right? Like if you look at the history of trying to make Dune, holy crap. And that's what Denis Villeneuve's like signing up for. He's like, yeah, I'm going to make a Dune movie.
This was my final wrap up, was going to be to mention the Denis Villeneuve thing, and just like the influence has to be there. There's no way you make a Dune film without Jodorowsky's
There was
influence.
a whole storyboard where they showed the ornithopters with freaking like insect wings, and it looked pretty dang similar to how they look in the new one.
Yeah. If everybody else is stealing from this like manuscript of a film, if the storyboard, everything's there, how could you possibly walk into a Dune film and not want to use some of those assets? And like, you know, I know he a lot of it was like really bombastic and over the top,
Yeah.
but a lot of it also had like good filmmaking in there and like good ideas for designs, and it would have been crazy to think that Denis Villeneuve didn't use it as an asset. And I'm sure Jodorowsky would appreciate that at this point. I'm sure he's a filmmaker that he admires.
He's talking about Orson Welles, right? He's talking about this iconic shot. And he's like, I wanted to do that, but better. And he's like, wants to cast Orson Welles to play, you know, Baron Harkonnen. And he has to do this whole thing with him about how he like convinced him to be in the movie. But then he got Orson Welles to, you know, agree to play Baron Harkonnen.
And Orson Welles is notoriously one of the hardest people to ever work with, and he's, you know, it's just wild.
That's who
This
he
guy-
wants. He's like, it's got to be him because he's so wild and like hard to work with. I want people like that. is
Well,
what
not
he
to mention
wanted.
he must, like, you know, making films in the 70s, like seeing Orson Welles and knowing Citizen Kane. And
Yeah.
it's so funny that these projects still collide. Like we covered Touch of Evil on another podcast, and then like the Warner from the very beginning. I mean, incredibly famous Warner, but like to think that he saw that and was like, let me draw inspiration from that and then make some like ridiculous.
And then they connected that to Contact and said that Contact maybe was inspired by his storyboard to make their opening. Just really cool, man. Terminator. Apparently there was like a sequence in Terminator where they think maybe was inspired by this. Now, I don't know if all of this is true, but
first person heads up display kind of thing, and seeing that in film, they're kind of saying that it was one of the first times that it had been done.
yeah. So like, I don't know, it's just super cool, very exciting, but also tragic, right? In a way that it never happened. All these people who seemed like they really sacrificed a lot. And honestly, it seems like almost everybody was fine except for him a little bit. Like, 'cause he didn't make another movie, it seemed like, after that, or not many at least. And then at the end of the documentary, they did reveal that he was rejoining with that original producer to make another film in 2013. So it's cool to see him kind of like back on the horse doing something. But it seems like it kind of sunk him for a while and stole a lot of his, you know, energy, because this thing, it was an embarrassment, they said, for him that it didn't happen. I can totally see that.
Again, I think the other thing that like is a blessing that it did exist and was able to be made is his comic books, like the way that he was able to create those comic books and just showing like outside of the DC Marvel sort of stratosphere, like there's plenty of comic books that are so influential, and like he would still go on to put a lot of the stuff in those comics. Like I think that's amazing. Yeah, I do think it's tragic that obviously it didn't work out how he would have hoped, but that's the risk that we take as artists, right? Like we're like putting ourselves out there, and sometimes it doesn't work out.
Absolutely, man. I mean, speaking about the novel, like that's something I've already thought about, is like, would it be embarrassing if this book never does what I want it to do? Absolutely, it'll be embarrassing. But you know, when that happens, it's like you can either let it sink you and you can, you know, never do it again, or you can keep trying. And so I already know I'm going to keep trying. You know, might I change some sort of my tactics or something? Sure. But like, I'm not going to give up if it doesn't work, and I'll do something else that is still writing related. So Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting lessons for artists, I think, in this documentary. So it's really cool to watch. And even for someone like me who's not a filmmaker, but just someone who tries to make art, even genre itself is kind of considered this. And it's funny because they're making a genre movie, they're making a sci-fi movie. It itself is tied to like sort of this populist, like you're making a thing that already has an established audience. A lot of the people who are genre fans like that genre, and you're appealing to fans of that genre. So there's already some potential capitalist motivations behind what you're doing. So this is all so messy, and so it's not a clearly defined border between trying to make money and trying to make art. When you're making something that you're going to sell and you're going to want people to go pay money to see or pay money to read, there is a capitalist component to that as long as you are operating in that sort of society, and we are. So I don't know. It's complicated. So like I just kind of gave my whole spiel about how I feel about it, but like I really am curious on your end as someone who, like, you've worked in commercials, you've done the things that you need to do to make money in the industry, you've seen lots of different kind of movies get made. How do you feel about that compromise that artists are having to strike to get things made? Like, and you already said you're not cynical about it, but like beyond that, like how do you feel about that? Like, do you think that that's good in any way, or is it just natural? What is it?
So I don't think of myself as so uncompromising that like is not willing to listen to any other perspectives.
If you start talking about rape in books, I think that we're in trouble.
Right. So like when I see someone like this, like in a similar way to you, there's a realist in me that doesn't think that I would personally go this far because I want my stuff to get made. I would compromise. I would do my best to collaborate. You know, as unfortunate as that may be, you know, but there are the filmmakers out there that are so single vision with their work. And I've always felt that like the relationship between like commerce and art is sort of, I don't like it. I don't like that like capitalism and all these other things come into play with this. But I do think that like an artist completely untethered in some ways can create things that aren't generally appealing. So I guess if you're trying to appeal like a large group of people, you do need a sort of parameters to keep your vision within, because otherwise you're just creating experimental films that go on for 24 hours or whatever. And like, not a lot of people see that, and it might be groundbreaking. But the thing is, like, if you want to, in my opinion, if you want to affect the culture, if you want to leave a lasting mark on the culture, you have to do something that a lot of people are going to see, and you have to find that balance between the two.
And they have to pay currency for your ideas, James. You capitalist pig.
Exactly. You, how dare you?
Yeah. No, I mean, I get what you're saying, man, because like we love an idea of this like free art that everyone can appreciate, and yet the artists still can like pay their bills if they have bills, or just like live off the like largesse of society. But we don't live in a world like that, you know? And so right now the system is I make something that people are willing to spend their money on. And in order to get someone to spend their money on it, you have to appeal to an audience, and that audience needs to be large enough to support what you're putting behind it, right? And in order to actually make enough money for it to pay out. And when you start talking about movies, those money amounts get really, really big, really easily. And, you know, there's some truth to what you're saying. But, like, amazing things get made sometimes when you ignore that shit. So, like, it goes both ways. And, like, I don't know, man. This is just an interesting case to talk about, right?
Yeah, if we don't have the people to push along new ideas and like sort of break the status quo, then we're going to become like just like everything's a Marvel movie, like cookie cutter sort of thing, which I'm not for.
We're kind of moving that way. I mean, it's like mega franchises, you know,
right.
What's the next Star Wars series coming out? And, you know, Disney kind of owns everything eventually, and is the mega studio in control of everything.
Yeah. And I've mentioned this kind of stuff to you before, but you look at a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, who did the Batman films, and then he like uses that to leverage his artistic films.
Oppenheimer. I'm so excited about Oppenheimer. Man.
Right. So you can't, you know, you're going to get those artistic films and you get the name recognition. You see Chris Evans as Captain America, and then you want to go see him in another film that's like an indie film.
I don't want to take it for granted that we're going to get that though, you know? Like what if the next generation that is getting drummed out of the industry, if it's moving in a direction of you know, Marvel and moving away from auteur. I don't know. I guess it's like I'm a little worried, but I don't know enough to really say.
I think everybody's worried. I don't think that there's a realistic expectation that anything will ever go away like that, because these things, as much as people don't want to admit it, like the cowboy movies were the largest movies in the world for a while. The superhero movies we're definitely seeing the most amount of superhero fatigue I've ever seen in the industry. And so like we're getting to a point where Marvel might not be the highest grossing films of all time. They might still be high grossing. They might not always be the most
Everything Everywhere All at Once just made $100 million, right?
Right. And that's what I mean. Like there's that balance. And then also the democratization of platforms. Like, although it sucks to have to pay for all these streaming services, there are different avenues for things to get made and different companies willing to shell out money to get these things made.
And it's sort of like this, the audience is so big now, as there's more people than ever, obviously with growing populations, but also just like you said, streaming services, there's more avenues. It's fractured in a way, but there is an audience out there for a lot of stuff that would have been really hard to find in the past.
And then that's not even to mention, like, the biggest obstacle I think is going to be this idea of where do theaters end up? Where do we see these things at? And I think we're always going to have theaters. I think that people want to leave the house to go have these massive experiences because it does feel bigger, like larger than life. But it's just about access to them. Like how easy or hard are they to get a hold of? And, you know, that's the tragedy of all, is like we're definitely closing a book. We're closing like a chapter at least in a book to where like we're moving into something different and it's not going to resemble what it was before. But I think like the entertainment, the idea of storytelling is always going to be something that people seek out for big events and for things that are different. So I have faith that like we're not going to see the end of the film industry and everybody's going to stay home forever and just watch everything on their phone. So we'll see how it all goes.
We got to wrap it up, man. We've gone long. Thank you all so much for listening. Until next time,
keep adapting.